Coming and hello and welcome. My name is Olivia. I use she, her pronouns. And today we're here to talk about parking management. Thank you for taking time out of your day and being here with us. We're really glad to see you all in this virtual world. Before we get started talking about parking though, a particular land use, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, in honor with gratitude, the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. A couple of important housekeeping items to note before we get started. We cannot see or hear you during the webinar. We're running a live Q&A at the end with all of the speakers, so please post your questions in the Q&A chat box. We will also be doing some live polling today to engage with you all and gather your feedback, so look out for those in the beginning and the end of webinar. I also post some links in the chat box throughout today's presentations from our speakers here, so look out for those. And if you do miss something in today's webinar, don't worry. We're going to be emailing out the slides afterwards and posting the recording to our YouTube page. Finally, I want to note that you can self-report this webinar for LEED continuing education credits. And so typically, and just last year on this very exact day, actually, we all huddled around a big conference table in our office in downtown Seattle at 7th and Olive and had a roundtable discussion with property managers working to implement effective transportation management programs. And while I do love a lunch and learn, and I'm really sad that I cannot be in person with all of you today and network and really get to know each and every one of you, I'm excited that this online webinar today has brought speakers from near and far and that it's more accessible to you all as well. So thanks again for coming out and joining us. We have an excellent program lined up, and before we dive in, let's just take a quick poll and see who's in the room with us today. Awesome. Most of you, about 75% or so, are voting. Most of you have been to a Commute Seattle event before. It's great to have you again, and thanks for joining. For those that haven't been before, thank you for coming out and joining one of our webinars and events, and we'd love to know how you heard about it, so feel free to put that in your feedback form after the webinar too. And it's great that you're all here wanting to learn new things and that you're really motivated about parking. That's really great. I'm going to share the results quick so you all can see what things are looking like. Awesome. And so today's program will open up with a key update on the Transportation Management Program. Joint Director's role from Ben Rosenblatt, a senior planner at the Seattle Department of Transportation. Ben will then hand the reins over to Wyatt Hoffman, an associate planner at Seattle DOT, to speak to the program's bicycle parking guidelines. From there, Kelly Urich at Fourth, a nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, dedicated to advancing electric, smart, and shared transportation, will focus on their workplace charging toolkit. And finally, we will round out today's webinar with an interview with our guest speaker, Allison Delong, a general manager at Tishman Speyer, 520 Pike Tower. And today, if you take one thing away from this webinar, it's that parking is so much more than just a place to store a personal vehicle. Again, thank you for joining today. We're really glad you're here. And without further ado, I will hand things over to Ben.
Great, thank you, Olivia. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to do just about a 10-minute or so update on a joint director's role update. So for those who manage TMPs or for those who know what they are, you know that we, the city, prescribe a lot of kind of guidance and rules around how a TMP gets developed and how we monitor and handle it from an enforcement standpoint. So we last updated the rule about 5 or 6 years ago. So we've been working on an update. Before I get to that though, I do want to show some general updates from our TMP program, just to share a couple of things, just a couple of slides here. I saw this article in the New York Times earlier this week about return to office plans being so uncertain And I believe even a Seattle-based employer was quoted in there. And I'm sure you all, the property management side, are definitely thinking about this. This slide itself on the left, the verbiage, I actually used back at a seminar that Commute Seattle hosted with the 2030 district back in the summer. And interestingly, not a lot has changed. We still are, requiring the TMP elements be in effect. However, given the changes in transportation habits, we kind of know that data is going to look different this year. We understand that. You'll be seeing from Commute Seattle the surveying that will occur in the fall. We still plan to do that. Obviously, who knows what the fall holds for us. I am hopeful, though, given some of the news recently on the vaccine front and other fronts, that we will be maybe a little bit more back to normal. And we're still looking forward. This is also another slide that I just repeated because I decided it still made sense. Building occupancy is going to go up. We at SDOT, with our partners at Commute Seattle, are definitely watching with a little bit of concern about a backslide to an over-reliance on SOV travel, especially while buildings are partially occupied, but not totally occupied. We kind of do expect that a lot of people will choose to drive, especially at the expense of transit. We're going to be doing some surveying with Commute Seattle in May of some folks downtown to try to see where people are at there. But Olivia and her team are available for you for free consultations. I highly encourage you to reach out. I'm sure everyone that's here today is pretty looped in with Commute Seattle's programming, but they're great and they can help you figure out how to manage your return to office planning. Okay, so the new director's rule. So as I mentioned, we last updated it in 2015. This is a joint rule between SDOT, my agency, and SDCI, the Department of Construction Inspections. So SDCI has the ultimate enforcement responsibility on permitting like TMPs. SDOT, however, is charged with monitoring, and that's the work that I do. So, first of all, it just goes without saying that this is a joint rule. We don't have anyone from SDCI here today, but if you have technical questions, you certainly can get in touch with me and I can get in touch with them about any interpretations on when a TMP is required or some of the very esoteric zoning considerations I'll get into. Nonetheless, another important thing to remember is this new rule is going to apply to new TMPs that are adopted. So if you currently manage a TMP that exists already, you don't necessarily have to worry about this, but I do think some of the updated elements may be useful in kind of thinking about how you put your TMP out there and put elements into motion. And a couple of links on the screen here. We can share the slides afterwards, I'm sure, for these links for folks to take a look. So when is a TMP required to begin with? And as any of you who may know, if you've gone through it recently, it can be very complicated. So this rule it attempts to clarify when the applicability and related authority come through, depending on the development proposal. They either come through two means. One is through SEPA, the environmental review process. The other is through the municipal code. There's been a bunch of changes to the municipal code since 2015 due to rezonings in several neighborhoods, and that's one element that's been updated. I'm going to flash a chart here. This is what we use internally to figure out if a TMP is required or not, and we use this in conjunction with SDCI and the zoning reviewers there. It is incredibly complicated. I wish it was more simple. This would involve, if we wanted to simplify this, more substantive changes to the code that an updated director's rule cannot accomplish. That said, there are lots of ways a TMP comes about. We're doing our best, and we've done a little bit better in the last couple of years on trying to let developers and applicants know as early in the process as possible if a TMP is going to be required, and if so, ways that they can start thinking about what elements will be in there. Another new element of the director's rule is going to be thinking about new modes or emerging modes. So since 2015, we've had two really new things come up. One is TNCs, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. The other is dockless device share, originally bikes, now scooters. So both of those things are new and they weren't referenced at all in the old rule. So we kind of cleaned that up and put in some new language around that. One element with the accounting side is that single occupancy TNC trips. So if I get in an Uber and ride on my own with a professional driver, we're going to categorize that as a single occupancy vehicle trip. And that's important because the TMP goal is typically an SOV goal. So, the policy rationale there is that, originally I think TNCs everyone thought of as ride sharing, and yeah, they probably do reduce car ownership to some degree. But we have found with some of our analysis that, and other cities have as well, that there's definitely a lot of excess miles traveled by TNCs when they're empty. They contribute to congestion. So sort of the spirit of the rule, they are the same as an SOV trip. So we're trying to limit that. And then the new rule also tries to look at other future changes in transportation, which, as we know, if we do this again in 5 years, I'm sure we'll have drones and AVs and all sorts of things like that. Another big update is the elements tables. So the items that one would have to put into a TMP. We've tried to clear up when something is required or just recommended. So that's a little bit clearer. There's also a separate table now for residential projects. So we understand, and we kind of saw in the last couple of years as more residential projects got hit with the TMP requirement, there's definitely a difference between the way residential projects work and the types of amenities and TDM strategies that are useful there than there are for commercial. So we've relaxed the surveying requirements there on residential projects. Transit and walking and biking subsidies are encouraged with them, but not required. Usually we see a lot of ORCA contracts, for example, happening at the employer level. And then finally, you still do have to biannually report back about the programming. Other elements updates is on some bike parking requirements, Wyatt's going to get into that, and then consolidated parking management section. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit since today is parking is the focus of today's webinar. So we kind of cut down the list compared to the prior director's rule. A lot of the concepts are actually still the same, but we just tried to cut it down. I think these 5 elements you see on the right here used to be like 7 or 8 or 9 elements. The pricing one, number 13 in particular, has some more detail, which I'll get into. Other elements, and you've probably heard this before from Commute Seattle, but always good to re-stress it, thinking about taking your parking out of your building space leases to make that monetary choice a separate decision for people, so that they see the true cost of parking. Providing number 15 and 16, providing reserve and free spaces for van pools or carpools. And number 17 for car share, we put in preferably electric vehicle car share parking into this rule, as the city does have a goal to electrify shared mobility by 2030. On the pricing side, none of this is probably too new either, but just stressing again, thinking about market rate or above for parking pricing, making sure parking is set so that short-term parking is encouraged and there's more turnover rather than all-day parking or early bird parking, which is a little bit less useful in changing overall behavior, and prohibiting price reductions for all-day parking, so kind of avoiding that early bird or other kind of move. And then flex-use parking passes, allowing people to be a little more flexible about when they park rather than just simply buying a monthly pass and feeling compelled to drive in every day. I think that's going to be even more important as people kind of do a flexible schedule with some remote work and other trips into the downtown core. And consider bundling them together to think about a strategy in conjunction with thinking about your parking supply up front. So that's another element that we really want to focus on today. Number 9 here is reducing your automobile parking supply below market demand for the type of land use and location. And that's, the market demand is sometimes a little bit hard to figure out. It can be a little chicken and egg. If you build the parking, it often becomes demanded because it's there. But really thinking about that early on, especially in your design and construction phases, which sometimes do happen before the TMP really gets going in terms of developing it. So that can be an issue. So I'm just kind of flagging that for folks here, just to kind of think about that. If you're involved with early stage development review or bringing developments online. Minimizing parking supply can be a really important element. I really want to stress this to achieving a TMP goal. There's been a recent research study that really corroborates a lot of what a lot of people have been thinking, but didn't maybe have the data for, is that as you build more parking, people drive more. It's not super surprising, but if you think about it, supply driving demand is definitely a thing with parking. And they have a few really good graphs. I highly encourage you to check out the article, which is linked here at the bottom here. You can see here, the more parking spaces you build per unit, this is a residential example, the parking ratio as it goes up, you see car ownership rate basically tracks almost linearly with the parking ratio, which makes sense. If there's enough space in the garage in your apartment building for 2 cars for each family, then a lot of them are going to have 2 cars. If not, they may have less. Same thing with the actual behavior. I thought this was really interesting, is that you see the column I have highlighted with the boxes. As people, as the parking ratio goes up, people drive more. So that 0.2 correlation shows that with every, I guess, 1 unit increase on the parking ratio side, there's 20% more driving. And then concurrently, there's less transit use, less walking, and less biking. So it really does make the link that as you build more parking, you induce more driving, and then vice versa. So this is an important element of TMPs. Often we start working with TMPs with property managers when it's a little bit too late. The building's been designed, the parking garage is set. And that does happen. And today, the rest of today's conversation is going to talk about, well, what could you do if you have that parking supply? What could you do differently with it to try to meet your TMP goals, meet the city's climate goals and equity goals, and things like that. So thank you, everybody. Maybe we'll have time for questions at the end, but I'm going to pass it over to Wyatt now. I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Olivia, for having us all here today. I'll go ahead and get my screen sharing here. 1 second. All right. Is that coming up okay, Olivia? Awesome. So my name is Wyatt Hoffman. I work at SDOT and previously managed our bike parking program. So I've got a kind of the fun counterpoint to Ben's talking about car parking. I get to talk about bicycle parking, and some of the same concepts apply here. But just really generally, the flow of this presentation is I'm going to start very high level and then get more down into specifics of things that you can do in your building, changes to think about, ideas of bike parking enhancements or just provision that could get more people coming to your building in a different way. So with that, I'll just jump right into it. So this is our standard SDOT slide. Our vision for Seattle is a thriving, equitable community powered by dependable transportation. Our mission is to deliver a transportation system that provides safe and affordable access to places and opportunities. And SDOT is committed to 6 core values: equity, safety, mobility, sustainability, livability, and excellence. And excellence is always the one that gets me as a little hard to define. I'm not really sure what that is, but I like it. So the high level, where did these bicycle parking guidelines come from? So I'm going to talk a little bit about our bicycle master plan here. So really high level overarching goals. The city is growing. That growth is contained to the city. Washington State has very strong growth management plan requirements, and that's a good thing, right? We want to contain growth to urban centers. We want to make sure that our urban centers densify, and instead of massively expanding, we want our farms to stay farms, we want our forests to stay forests. So containing all of our growth to urban centers is a good thing. With that said, if everybody that lives in Seattle gets around driving a car, no one's going to get anywhere. So we have ridership goals that are set forth in our bike master plan. And some of our goals in there are tripling of 2014's bike counter numbers by 2030, as well as a much less specific goal of a increase in bicycle commuter percentage mode split. So as of 2014, I believe that was about 4% commute mode split, and we want to see that trend increasing because as we grow, that means more people riding. A greater percentage of a bigger number of people is always good for space efficiency as well as congestion. So with that, the rest of this presentation is going to focus on requirements. So I'll get into that in the next slide. And then parking can be both a necessity and an amenity. And so I want to touch a little bit more on the differences between those things. As Ben mentioned, right, as supply increases for car parking, demand increases for car parking. And that same kind of trend can happen with bicycle parking. It's a little less studied, I'll say. But there are things that you can do that can make your parking turn from a necessity that serves existing riders into an amenity that can attract new riders. And so we'll also be talking a little bit about the differing types of parking for different types of users and uses. So Ben mentioned the difference between commercial and residential buildings. That will play a part. You really need to make sure that you're providing amenities that serve your users and the types of uses you're seeing, whether that is someone coming to an office and working all day long, or someone making a short visit and popping in as a customer or for an appointment or something like that. So with that, this is our slide on requirements. So this applies to new buildings and major land use changes. And these are baseline requirements for number of bike parking spaces to provide. And so these are available in that reference there in our Seattle Municipal Code, in our land use code. It is a section on required parking, and then bicycle parking is like the 15th bullet down in there. And then there's a table based on your land use and the size of your development, the required number of spaces to provide. That also sets forth some less quantitative performance standards that this document on the screen right now, the director's rule, gets into. And that just clarifies performance standards that are in that land use code. It's things like what is a highly visible location or what counts for fully weather protected long-term parking. So again, those apply to new buildings, not necessarily if you have an existing building, these probably won't apply to you unless your building is going through a major land use change. And so getting more into the specifics, we worked for a long time on getting these guidelines finished and publicly posted. And these guidelines are attached to the director's rule that I previously mentioned. So they're available at the same link and it's all in the same spot. So you get to see the requirements and then right after that, it's suggested improvements essentially. So the guidelines are presented not as requirements, but they do reiterate some of the requirements. And they also offer a lot of ideas about different types of enhancements you can do to your on-site parking. It also talks about SDOT's process for installing things in the right-of-way. So new developments, a portion of short-term parking, which is, we define that as parking for 4 hours or less. So typically visitor parking. A portion of that can be put in the right-of-way. So this also gets into our standards for putting things in the right-of-way and our designs when we do that. So the qualitative guidance in here, again, it just is like, it's a great resource to get ideas of things to do. And then it also has a lot of examples of good parking and not so good parking in terms of the physical infrastructure, right? So the bike rack itself. So I know that this probably is not going to come through all that well on your screen, and I apologize for that, but hopefully you'll be able to get a better sense with the document and then once we send these slides out. But I want to just touch on a couple of these points. So this is in our guidelines, and this is our page on good and not so good examples of bike parking. So I want to touch just up on a couple of these. So in terms of good short-term bicycle parking, these are things that go way beyond the minimums. But there is up in the top, I'm not gonna be able to describe it because I put this in there in a very bad place, I apologize. But in the top, the very top row on the left side, the very far right, guidelines page 14, the top right corner. There we go, thank you, Olivia, I appreciate the nods. That's an example of some short-term bike parking on UW campus that has a lot of added amenities, right? So the baseline, what I was saying, bike parking is a necessity. So existing riders will ride, right? They'll ride, they'll lock up to poles, they'll lock up to trees, they'll make it work. But to really attract new riders and make it feel like this is an option for a lot of different people, there are amenities that make it feel more comfortable. So this example is some short-term bike parking that is covered. So it's rain protected. It's also lighted on the underside, so it's safer at night. And UW campus, I mean, it gets dark at 4 p.m. in the winter, right? And classes go till 6, 7, 8 p.m. So that's a pretty important part of getting people riding and feeling safe to ride. And then another additional amenity that this has is a fix-it stand, and that just lets people make minor repairs on their bicycle in the event that they need it. Hopefully they don't, but you know, riding a bicycle has its own kind of unique quirks. And then talking a little bit about some of the long-term bicycle parking examples. So this is on the right side of the screen, guidelines page 19, top row, the middle photo. That is an interesting example of how artwork can make a concrete wall feel a little bit more inviting. Also a really good example of good lighting, right? So that's a place that might even be tucked away in the corner of a parking garage, but because it's lit and because it has some inviting artwork, it also has another fix-it stand and makes it a little bit more usable. It just feels a little better, right? It's a little inviting. There are still other things you could do in that space potentially, like there are programming aspects that can help support the use of a bike room. So we can talk a little bit about that on this slide. So the variety of bicycle types, that is a big deal actually, and it's becoming a more big deal as e-bikes explode in popularity. So a lot of our requirements are based on just regular pedal bikes. So you need to pedal to move the bike. E-bikes are kind of changing the game. And so one of the really important things to think about is, where are people going to charge if your building users are riding e-bikes? Because e-bikes really level the playing field for a lot of people. They make our hills not so, sweaty, basically. It's a lot more comfortable to get to work or home or wherever you're going if you can get there without putting a ton of effort into it. So e-bikes are kind of a huge deal actually, of like, where do you charge that when you're storing your bicycle for the day? But also family bikes, cargo bikes, things like that. People that use non-standard bicycle designs, they all have different form factors. So the space that you're allocating for your bike parking can be, there are different things to think about depending on who is using that space. And what that essentially looks like is just providing different types of parking, right? It's hard to park a cargo bike on a vertical stud. It might be easier to park it if you have some horizontal spaces as well in the mix. Including micromobility in the mix. This is an interesting one. Ben touched on it a little bit, but micromobility, shared bikes and shared scooters, is something that looks like it's here to stay. We're not sure what that will look like, right? It may look different in 3 years, and 5 years, and 10 years. It almost certainly will look different, but it's here to stay. And it's also a way to kind of, again, just like promote, hey, this is something that you can do, right? Especially when you're talking about your short-term parking. So this is parking that could be placed either on-site or off-site, but near your building entrance. If you have a mixture of racks that are for personal bikes or devices to lock to, as well as just kind of some open space next to it that could be perhaps bounded by a box. I have an image here of our standard on-street corral design. This is a design that's intended to fit into the space of one car parking space. So, get the gears turning maybe 5 years from now, or potentially, right? But if, say, our real estate situation changes, our return to office or return to work situation changes, and maybe there is unused space in your parking garage, there are opportunities to kind of transform what you have currently into something new. Not saying that that's necessarily the case for everybody, but a potential option to think about. And then I'm going a little over, so I'm just going to talk about programming real quick. Things like bike buddies, like having a pool of people that are comfortable bike commuting and can recruit other people, or at least be available if other people are interested in trying it. Things like that. Bike classes, right? Say you have a fix-it stand in your bike cage. You can have a class once a month of, hey, here's how to make a minor repair, here's how to fix a flat, things like that, that just let people know, hey, I can be supported in this. And it's not just, oh, okay, here's a place to park, but here's how to use it. Here's how to actually feel fulfilled while I'm choosing this potentially very new and very different mode of transportation. And I will leave it at that.
All right, so that's queuing up my presentation. Thanks, Wyatt, and thank you to Olivia for hosting my slides for me today. So hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Yerrick. I'm a program manager at Fourth, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I do want to just introduce my organization. Unlike most here, most of the speakers here, you may not have heard of my organization. So Fourth is a nonprofit. We are based in Portland, Oregon, but really we serve certainly the entire Pacific Northwest, and growing in our geographic footprint across the country by the day. We do a lot of different things, but just to highlight a few, we do some industry networking. We host conferences and webinars to bring together industry players. We do policy advocacy, largely in Oregon and also at the federal level. And then finally, we lead demonstration projects and lead consumer education and outreach activities to accelerate the adoption of clean transportation technologies. And go ahead and go to the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely around workplace charging. And I just want to preface all of my comments by saying that I appreciate following Wyatt's remarks about e-bikes, because though I am going to be focusing on electric vehicles. We certainly support any and all efforts to electrify the bikes space and supporting electric bike riders at the workplace. So a lot of what I'm going to say today, I think the benefits translate into bikes as well as vehicles. So just this slide, super briefly, what I'm going to be talking about today is mostly in the level 2 space of EV charging, which is charging that's run on a 240 volt circuit. And then as it relates to e-bikes, if you wanted to provide charging for e-bikes, those are just going to be, simply adding a few 110 outlets in your bike storage areas, and most e-bike users will be able to access that. All right, next slide. So why install workplace charging? Well, there are several reasons why a business or a parking facility might be interested in installing charging. And it will look different at particular properties, depending on a number of different cases. That said, making the decision to provide access to EV charging has shown to increase the adoption of electric vehicles. Studies have also shown that 52% of employees believe their employers should be doing more for the environment. So making the commitment demonstrates leadership in this space. Simply seeing charging stations and becoming more aware of them at the workplace means that seeing coworkers that drive electric can go a long way in convincing people to make the switch themselves. And then finally, if your business is in the transition stages of converting its fleet to electric vehicles, there may be opportunities to leverage workplace chargers during the evening hours to charge fleet vehicles, and then allowing those to be used by the general public during the day. All right, next slide. And of course, aside from the employer benefits that I sort of mentioned on the last slide, workplace charging is immensely valuable to employees, especially those without access to charging at home. It's the second most likely place for EV owners to charge. And as adoption rates continue, a larger portion of EV drivers will live in multi-unit dwellings and likely face charging gaps at home that can be filled at the workplace. Additionally, for drivers that own plug-in hybrid vehicles, being able to charge at work also allows them to maximize their electric vehicle miles traveled by recouping the electric fuel that they use during their commute. And then finally, it's a fairly low-cost employee benefit to provide, as you might compare it to health insurance or things of that nature, providing access to charging. Even it doesn't have to be free access, but just any access to charging is a really important and increasingly important employee benefit. All right, so for this next slide, I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at what a timeline might look like for an EVSE install. And I'll just mention that the next couple of slides come out of a workplace charging toolkit that Forth has put together, and you'll have access to that full toolkit. So don't try to necessarily have taken everything that I'm sharing today. But with that said, I just want to highlight that the roadmap both begins and ends with engaging employees. It'll be important to educate and secure buy-in from leadership, and in many cases, creating a team of stakeholders to carry out the process. And as property managers, you're certainly a really important piece of that conversation. But there are others that I think you might benefit to work with if this is something that you're interested in doing. Let's see, I know I'm really going to be really short on time, so I'm going to skip over a couple of these details. Let's see, I think I'll just kind of skip to the program implementation side of things. So this is a really important step. I mentioned that, like the beginning, it involves engaging employees, engaging employers as well. And the reason for this is that the last thing you would want to do is install a bunch of EV chargers and then they never get used. similar to, some of the remarks that previous speakers made about, if you build parking, they will come. Most EV drivers are going to find EV charging if it's installed. There are lots of tools out there to help them do that. That said, if your interest is really in helping to grow EV adoption, what might be overlooked are new chargers to non-EV drivers. So doing things like hosting events, doing a ribbon cutting ceremony, and actually engaging employees that currently drive electric to come out and show off their vehicle and talk about their experience can be a really good just employee engagement event or opportunity, but also it ties back into this investment that you've made in your property or in your business. Okay, next slide. All right, so this slide also has kind of a lot to digest, but what I've tried to do is just sort of break down what potential costs, upfront costs there are, because this is one of the biggest barriers to EV infrastructure installation are the costs and also the unknowns of, kind of what the process should look like. So breaking down the costs here, there are going to be a lot of uncertain things that I would recommend, that we mostly recommend people reach out to their utility pretty early on in the process, because utilities are going to be really well suited to help you understand what your electrical capacity is on site and what upgrades might be needed to move forward with an installation. There are incentives available. One is at the federal level. The Alternative Fuels Data Center has an alternative fuels infrastructure credit, tax credit that can allow for up to 30% off the total cost of an installation, up to $30,000. And this is something that is available to any entity. So you don't, there aren't any sort of specific requirements to be able to access that as long as you're a tax-paying entity. And then, I would just encourage you to be on the lookout for any other local incentives that might be available. I'm not aware of any currently in the Seattle area, but the utilities, like I said, they're not only a key partner in this, but they're also increasingly a place to look for incentives and opportunities and to help bring down those infrastructure costs. And then on the flip side of it, you'll see opportunities to actually bring in revenue to help offset some of those upfront costs that you might have to make. So you can you'll need to make decisions about whether you want to provide free charging. Most likely you won't. You'll want to charge for electricity for a number of different reasons to ensure that the chargers have enough turnover and that they're able to be utilized by the most number of people. And so yeah, with that, I think actually, Olivia, for the sake of our time today, I think I just want to pause very briefly on the next slide. So this kind of gets into this question of networked versus non-networked chargers. And it's sort of a complex decision to make depending on what you're looking to get out of installing chargers. Network versus non-networks essentially just means whether it's connected to the internet and allows for payment mechanisms and sort of usage monitoring and control. The ability to connect to the internet and have some of those features is going to be a lot more of an upfront as well as an ongoing cost. But it allows you to do a lot of things like try to recoup some of your costs throughout the course of ownership of the chargers. And then I'll just kind of end on like one more thought on this is that you may not be paying attention to the number of EVs in your parking facilities at the moment. And it's possible that there aren't any EVs there. It's also possible that 60% of the cars driving in are EVs in a place like Seattle. So I would encourage you, as you think about going down this journey, if it's something that if it's an investment that you're interested in making, to do a lot of surveying and get an understanding of what vehicles are there, and don't necessarily just respond to what's there now, but try to plan for what might be coming in the future. Because those investments in electrical capacity and building out the infrastructure are going to pay off for you more quickly if you're preparing for future growth. And then, yeah, lastly, like I said, if you want to check out the toolkit, you'll have access to that afterwards. And then I do just want to mention on my final slide here, Fourth is also recently launched is launching a workplace charging certification program. And this is a program that will recognize and provide a roadmap for businesses and organizations that are interested in supporting e-mobility friendly commuting styles. So that doesn't just mean workplace charging, it also includes bike commuters, commuters that are bringing in public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are interested in learning more about that program, my contact information is here, but you'll also be able to find me after the fact. All right, and that is all for me, Olivia. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate your presentation. A lot to learn there and a lot to unpack as well. Allison, welcome, and it's great to round things out with a great conversation with you and I here together today. I'm really excited to have you here. I'm just going to introduce a little bit about who you are, Allison, and where you work. And so Allison Delong is a general manager for Tishman Speyer and has managed 520 Pike Tower in downtown Seattle since 1999. She started her career with an 8-building portfolio, also in downtown Seattle, spending several years managing their tenant services department and later becoming the property manager of a 1.5 million square foot office retail property. Allison is Seattle born and raised and has been riding Metro buses since her teenage years. And she's used the light rail to commute to work since it began operating as well. She used to own a Prius and is really excited and expects that her next car will be an EV. So if you could join me in welcoming Allison, and really, again, thank you for joining us today as our guest speaker. We're really excited to have you here.
Thank you, Olivia, for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and Allison, I'm just gonna give a little bit of a brief on the building itself for our audience here. And so 520 Pike Tower, it's in the heart of downtown Seattle and was built in 1983. At that time, it was the cusp of the Transportation Management Program, which again is a policy that affects new development through their master use permit process. 520 Pike Tower's commitment outlined fundamental strategies like priority parking and parking rates for carpools, but was relatively simple at the time. Property managers like Allison wear many hats, and one of which is to work to implement the Transportation Management Program, but also to keep the building's facilities fresh and modern and welcoming for tenants. Allison, you grew up in Seattle and you have been commuting to downtown for some time. You've had a really great privilege to see the transportation network and downtown and beyond expand immensely and really grow, and also to see new commute options really change people's lives for the better. And I'm also sure that the building has seen its iterations, and facilities and amenities are constantly changing. So tell us a little bit more about 520 Pike Tower and how it has evolved to keep up with Seattle's competitive real estate market.
Sure. So as you mentioned, Olivia, the TMP that 520 Pike is under, because our building was developed so long ago, is very, very simple. And sometimes when I come to these seminars, I think, oh my goodness, I'm so lucky, because we really don't have a lot of requirements beyond offer carpool discount parking and a few other things. But compared to what new buildings are required to do, our requirements are relatively straightforward. However, we've really done a lot of things here at the building because that's what our tenants want. It's not because the city is making us, it's because it's what we've chosen to do, because we want to be competitive and attract our tenants and serve what they want. So when the building was built, there wasn't really much going on in our area. We're at the corner of 6th and Pike. And not too long later, the US Bank Center got developed, One Union Square was built, Westlake Tower was built, and the city started to shift more in this neighborhood, in this direction. The federal courthouse went up. And so where the city used to really be much more centered around the King County Courthouse, suddenly we're just in the middle of everything. And so we often refer to ourselves as being on the 50-yard line. And along with that development, Some people who are new to the city may not realize that the Link Tunnel started out as the Metro Bus Tunnel. So in 1990, the bus tunnel opened, and we're just a block away from the Westlake station at Nordstrom. And then in 2009, it became the Link Tunnel, further making us kind of the center of things. And also, when I first started at the building a million years ago, we had a small gym, but it wasn't very common for office buildings to have gyms. In fact, I think we may have been the only one in Seattle. And we also had 2 men's showers, 2 women's showers, but it was a pretty small facility. With my previous company, I had to often tell tenants, sorry, if you want to bike to work, we don't have any shower facilities for you. And I think that used to be really common for most buildings. I could say, go to the WAC or go to the Y, depending on your income. So it was great when I came to 520 Pike that we actually had a gym and showers for people to use. We also had a very small bike parking area. And at the time, ownership was loath to give up any parking spaces to extend bike parking. But over time, as LEED became more important, and we got our LEED certification, and the tech industry and younger tenants came along, there was just much more of a demand for bike parking. And so we added bike parking. We eventually caged it, and we now have an access card reader. It's on security cameras, so people feel comfortable that they can park their bike there and not worry about what's going to happen while they're at the office. We have a bench so they can sit down and change their shoes. And I think it was Wyatt that was talking about fix-it stations. We've got a fix-it station for our bike area. And then we also added EV charging stations. And a lot of buildings, I think maybe 10-ish years ago, there were federal subsidies, and it was a time when they were really trying to build out the EV charging network on the West Coast. So we were able to take advantage of those subsidies so that we could put in EV charging. And I knew at the time that 4 EV stations was way more than we would use. And there were a handful of times I was so excited to see all 4 of them get used at the same time. And now we've added 4 more EV charging stations. So we've done some of this because it's what leadership believes in. It's partly because we get the benefit of LEED credits for doing some of these things. And we also have building engineers who ride rad power bikes. And so they had the idea of adding a pull down power cord so that users can charge their bikes too. So we've done a lot of fun things.
Awesome. And I've noticed too, just like what a bit of green paint really does to brighten up and make your tenant amenities more visible, whether or not that's the walls in your bike room, which are super bright and really inviting as well. I want to park my bike in there any day. And just a simple paint and what that can do for your building as well.
Yeah, and the earlier speaker mentioned having graphics and really making it feel cheerful. I have really tried to think about color coding. So, in Seattle, we all know that blue is for recycling and brown is for compost and black is for trash. And so, green is for EV and bike parking. And so we have signage in the building color coded so that intuitively people can figure out what they're looking for.
For those that are huge transportation wonks, we like to call it fresh Kermit paint out there, or fresh Elmo for a protected and bus only lane out there too, which really corresponds well with what you see in the community too.
Yeah, I'd like to see an official paint color because I'm just updating some signage now. And the first draft they sent back was a little too kind of foresty green, and I need to brighten it up.
Interesting. Maybe Wyatt has an official color palette for you that we could share after this.
That would be great.
While we're still talking though about bicycle parking, you mentioned earlier about gradually needing to expand bicycle parking at 520 Pike Tower. And back in 2016, you toured some properties with great bicycle parking and worked with Commute Seattle to be able to understand what your options were. What did you learn from that experience? And maybe what would you do differently next time?
Well, I want to say that Commute Seattle is a really great resource. And so, I obviously everybody on this call knows about you. But if they're not ready to do some of these things yet, just to remember to come back to you 6 months or a year from now, what have you, because we were directed to buildings that we didn't know that had good bike parking. Property managers, I think in the Seattle area, have pretty friendly competition. And so I was able to call on a lot of my peers who were very willing to give me tours of their building gyms and their bike parking so that we could see what people were doing in other buildings, because we can get really insulated in our own little building and it becomes our universe and we forget to step outside of it. So it was really, it was only slightly time consuming to go take some walks and just go visit some other buildings. We focused on what type of bike racks seemed really space efficient, that we could fit the most bikes in. But we also were advised to make sure we kept the ground mounted bike racks so that people who have bigger, heavier bikes, at the time e-bikes weren't so popular, or people who just frankly weren't strong enough to lift their bikes or might have, racks and other sorts of things. So one size doesn't fit all, and having a multitude of styles is really helpful. So we shopped a lot of different type of bike racks before we found one that we thought worked well.
Awesome. I think broadly with commuting and transportation, one size doesn't fit all. And we know Seattle commuters and how we get around is very multimodal. And so I appreciate that in that way, having a lot of options and shopping around and doing your research at the end of the day too, and really seeking your industry too for help and what that can look like and support as well. That's a really great example and some great takeaways for other folks in the audience as well.
And I'll just add too that the bike fix-it station is literally called Fix-It. So if you Google bike fix-it station, there's this really great unit that you can find online that is kind of universal. I think for bike riders will be familiar, and it is much appreciated by our tenants.
Absolutely. Not having to lug all of those tools and equipment with you as a bicycle rider is very much appreciated. I can say that for myself. But I want to save a couple minutes for whatever questions we may have. And Allison, for our conversation today, maybe we can conclude it out with thinking about the future a little bit and considering Seattle's growth and the expansion of light rail to Northgate, and then over to the east side in just a couple years, office recalibration and what that looks like for return to work planning, and really all of these other changes that we're faced with. What are the most critical changes that we must make to face the future really effectively and approach it as a community?
Well, I think, somebody else posted a question earlier asking what are buildings going to do in terms of pricing their parking. And that is one of the factors as well. I think just being flexible and understanding that we really don't know what we should expect in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. I'm hopeful that as we're told that by May we should all be able to get immunized, and so I've been driving since the pandemic started, and I miss the walk up the hill to the light rail station and getting a little bit of exercise in, and I'm looking forward to a time when I can feel comfortable taking transit again. But also, there's been a lot of talk about how much are people going to keep working from home, how much are they going to transition back to the workplace, and so we're really thinking about how can we help tenants, share a monthly parking space, or how can we help them figure out ways that they can find a hybrid of transit versus driving, and potentially repurposing parking spaces, potentially expanding the bike space. As property managers, we just always have to keep being flexible and see what our tenants need and what they want, and be ready to provide that.
Awesome. I love it. Flexibility and choices, another great thing to be able to take away from today. Allison, it's really been a pleasure getting to know you more and having you here today. We can really learn a lot from your experiences and the amenities and facilities that 520 Pike Tower has in place there, and what you're all evolving and integrating and moving towards in the future as well. Doubling that EV parking is something to be really proud of. I don't know if we have questions in the chat box. My screen looks a little weird on my end, but let's open it up and bring Kelly, Wyatt, and Ben back and see what questions we have from the audience here today. It looks like some are coming through, which is really great.
I see that Heidi had a question about parking flexibility. As it happened, we had just updated our parking revenue control equipment literally at the end of 2019. And so we're able to allow people to do, for example, online parking validation. So the company can allow people to, validate their parking every day, so that maybe somebody only parks once a week instead of has a monthly parking pass to drive 5 days a week. Similarly, our system allows people to have a QR code as their parking pass, and so they could share that, so that they could potentially have 5 different people use a monthly parking pass. So you can talk to your parking equipment or your parking management company about what type of system you have, and think about those types of flexibilities if you're thinking about upgrading your parking equipment to add some of that flexibility.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. And Ben, I'm not sure if you wanted to answer out loud the question about impact, the way properties provide parking post-pandemic, or that question. I see you answered it live in the chat box too.
Yeah, and interestingly, Allison kind of just hit some of those themes of flexibility, and I guess a lot of it, interesting, is a lot really related to the technology and like what the backend systems are capable of or not capable of. But yeah, I'm hoping it becomes more flexible, because I do think, some people will come in once or twice a week. Sometimes it'll make sense to take the bus when it's safe. Sometimes it won't. So I think flexibility is definitely the name of the game.
Absolutely. And it looks like there is a question in there for me specifically, hearing about businesses and what they want from property managers as they come back, evidence of COVID safety standards in the bike room, providing transit passes, daily parking. And I think this isn't an anonymous attendee, but those are really great examples already in what you're thinking about. And yes, I think definitely people on the theme of flexibility and choices, most people are probably going to come back to the office a couple days of the week, and they're probably going to maybe think about different ways to get there each of those days of the week before they develop some standard travel behavior patterns. The other really great thing about this is just the idea of the fresh start effect. And so everyone is in a new patterns. When we're going back to work, you're going to be starting things new again, and that doesn't need to mean that you're going back to the way that you were traveling to the office a year ago, or whatever that may look like. And so having things in place that are giving them the ability to make choices on the daily is really what I would recommend for the property managers too, whether or not that's daily parking or how much bike storage you have in your building, and really monitoring that on the daily as well. So we're just about at our hour here today, and I think we got through a handful of questions, which is great. And I just want to note too that I will be following up with the slides and posting a recording to Commute Seattle's YouTube page after it's available. And I'd really just want to say thank you for joining and sticking around with us for the hour. And I have one last poll before we leave here today to see what topics you would like to hear from Commute Seattle next time. So I'm going to launch this quick. And for those that are still with us, we can take another survey. All right, there's still some trickling in. I feel very privileged over here to just see the results on my end before I get to share them with you. And we are at 3 o'clock, and so if you have places to be, I understand there's not a lot of time in between meetings these days. So if you have to leave, we really appreciate your time in joining us here today. And I'll be following up with the slides and recording afterwards. Let's end the polling and share what we have here. Overwhelmingly, folks seem to be really interested in shared mobility, bike, scooter, car share. And that's a great topic and something that we touched on a little bit here today. And we've already got some conversations in the works about how to bring you a great webinar or event for that here coming soon. So stay tuned and be sure to check out commuteseattle.com/events for more stuff. Thank you all for joining here today. I really appreciate your time. I'm gonna go ahead and close out the webinar. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Olivia.
Yeah, thanks.